The slap Sloan Whitmore delivered cracked across the helipad like a rifle shot, heard by every employee frozen in the mountain wind. She was certain Reed Callahan, the widowed mechanic who had touched her company's most critical aircraft, had sabotaged the flight that could save everything she had built. Reed did not raise his voice. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and pulled his sleeve down. He was not fast enough. Gareth Boone, Sloan's head of security, had already seen the crescent-shaped burn scar on Reed's wrist, the mark of a man who had once saved his life. Stay until the end to learn why the man she humiliated was the only one still telling the truth. The morning had begun the way mornings always do before something irreversible happens, with ordinary tasks moving at an ordinary pace, no visible sign of the hours ahead. At the private test facility outside Colorado Springs, the ground crews for Whitmore Rotorcraft had arrived before sunrise to prepare the Whitmore Aegis X-9, the most advanced search and rescue helicopter the company had ever built, for the most important demonstration flight in its history. Sloan Whitmore was scheduled to pilot the aircraft herself to Denver, where a consortium of regional hospitals was waiting to sign a 40-unit supply contract, a deal large enough to pull the company clear of the acquisition threat that had been circling it for the better part of 2 years. Every senior manager on the property knew what the contract meant, and the pressure of that knowledge had seeped into every corner of the facility by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Jonah Kessler, the company's chief test pilot, had not slept. He was 58 years old, with 3 decades of rotary wing experience stamped into the lines of his face, and something he had heard during the previous night's pre-flight check had not let him rest. It was a faint metallic resonance from the tail rotor control assembly, not loud enough to trigger any onboard diagnostic, not sharp enough to be called a knock, but present in a way that his body recognized as wrong, the way a hand recognizes heat before the mind has time to name it. Jonah had filed nothing officially because he had nothing official to file. What he had was a phone number belonging to Reed Callahan, a name that still meant something to the people who cared about what a helicopter actually did in the air. Reed arrived at 6:40 in the morning in a battered gray pickup, wearing work pants and a canvas jacket that had seen better decades, and the 2 guards at the maintenance gate almost turned him away before Jonah appeared and vouched for him. He was 42, average in height, with the kind of stillness about him that people sometimes mistook for indifference, a quality that actually came from the opposite of indifference, from a habit of observing carefully before speaking at all. He carried a handheld inspection kit and a flashlight, and he moved through the facility the way someone moves through a room they have been in before, without hurry, without asking where things were, with eyes that went straight to the structure of things rather than their surfaces. What Reed found on the tail rotor pitch control linkage took him less than 12 minutes to confirm. The bolt he pulled for inspection bore a laser-etched manufacturing code that did not correspond to any entry in the aircraft's maintenance log, a discrepancy that, to most people, might have meant a simple record-keeping error, but to Reed meant the component had not come from a certified aerospace supplier. The metal's surface color was off by a shade that only someone who had held thousands of certified fasteners in their hands would catch, and the wear pattern across the threading was inconsistent with the aircraft's actual flight hours. He tagged the aircraft red, the universal ground stop notation, and disconnected the starter relay according to the emergency safety protocol he had been trained to follow so many years ago that it had become reflex. Blaine Carrington arrived on the helipad at 7:15. He was the company's chief operating officer, 54 years old, polished in the way of men who have learned that a calm voice and an expensive suit project authority, even when the underlying argument is weak, and he surveyed the situation with an expression of measured disappointment that he had clearly practiced. He declared that Reed had no jurisdiction to ground a Whitmore aircraft, that the maintenance records had been certified the previous evening, and that an unauthorized individual had just placed his hands on a machine worth several tens of millions of dollars. He made a phone call, and then he sent a message, and within 4 minutes the tone of the conversation on the helipad had shifted from concern to accusation. Sloan was in the executive building when she received the alert from Carrington, and she had already been carrying the weight of a call from the company's primary lender. A call in which the phrase breach of credit facility had been used twice in 3 minutes. She crossed the tarmac with the stride of someone who has made up her mind before reaching her destination, which is among the most dangerous ways a person in authority can move. When she saw the X9 standing dark and silent with a red tag clipped to the cockpit door, and when she saw Reed Callahan standing beside it, holding a small metal component in one grease-stained hand, she heard the conclusion Carrington had already planted in her mind, and she moved toward it the way a current moves toward the lowest available ground. Reed looked at her when she stopped in front of him and said, simply and without raising his voice, that the aircraft was not permitted to leave the ground, and that was where the morning made its turn. For a long moment after the sound of the slap, no one on the helipad moved. The wind came off the mountains in a long, cold sweep, and it moved the flag at the corner of the facility, and it did nothing else. Reed stood exactly where he had been standing. He did not step back. He did not change his expression from what it had been, which was the expression of a man watching something he had expected to happen and found no satisfaction in being right about. When Sloan demanded that he return the component and restore the aircraft to operational status, he told her, without raising his voice, that if the bolt in question failed during flight, the pilot would lose tail rotor authority within a 2-second window at any speed above 60 knots, which was not survivable at low altitude. Carrington stepped between them and told Sloan that he had personally reviewed the inspection reports and that Reed's reading of the component was incorrect, and then added, in the tone of someone who has saved the best fact for last, that Reed Callahan's certification had been revoked 8 years prior following a crash attributed directly to his decision-making in conditions that exceeded his authorization. Sloan recognized the name from a file she had skimmed years before, a crash case that the company's legal team had managed quietly and efficiently, a file she had never had reason to open fully. She told Reed that she understood what he was doing and why, and that Whitmore did not negotiate with contractors who used safety violations as leverage. Reed said, one more time and with great patience, that the aircraft could not fly. What stopped Sloan from raising her hand a second time was not self-control, but the sound of Gareth Boone's footsteps on the concrete behind her. Deliberate, measured, the walk of a man who is not hurrying because he has already decided on a course of action and is simply carrying it out. Gareth was 49, built like the result of a long argument between a wall and a person, and he had been Sloan's head of security for 6 years, having served as Everett Whitmore's personal detail for 11 years before that. In all those years, Sloan had seen him break protocol exactly once. He stepped forward past her, past Carrington, to stand directly in front of Reed, and reached out and took Reed's wrist gently in one large hand, turning it so the crescent-shaped scar on the inside caught the morning light. He looked at it for 3 full seconds, then looked at Reed's face, and said one word quietly, the way a man says the name of a place he has not spoken aloud in years, North Star. It was the call sign that had been assigned to Reed's rescue aircraft 8 years ago. Reed looked at Gareth without warmth, without recognition performed for anyone watching, and said that the last time they had spoken, Gareth had promised to tell the truth about what had happened that morning. Gareth said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to Sloan, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been carrying a debt long enough that setting it down might cause him to fall. He told her, steadily and without softening it, that the man she had just struck in front of the entire facility was the man who had pulled her father and Gareth himself out of a burning helicopter with nothing between his hands and the hot metal but a sleeve of work denim. Sloane's first reaction was to look at Carrington, and Carrington said, evenly, that Gareth might be confusing Reed with one of the official rescue team members who had arrived on scene. Gareth said he was not confused. He described the crash, a rocky slope in a February storm, an aircraft on its side with the engine compartment burning, 2 men trapped by jammed harness locks that had been heated by the fire, with the specificity of someone who spent 8 years trying not to remember it clearly. He said Reed had gone into the wreck twice, once for Everett, once for him. The scar came from the second trip, from Reed using his bare hand to free a lock that had been heated past the point of safe contact. Sloane looked at Reed, and Reed said nothing about what had happened. Instead, he held out the small bolt, its laser-etched code facing up, and told her to look at the manufacturer's prefix. The prefix matched the code on a component recovered from the wreckage of a Whitmore aircraft 8 years ago. A file she had never opened, a detail she had never known to look for. Sloane moved everyone into the private engineering suite off the main hangar, and she locked the door behind them. All of them, Carrington included, because she was not yet certain enough of anything to make an exclusion she could not take back. She sat at the head of the table with the bolt in front of her and asked Reed to tell her what had happened 8 years ago, and he told her in the flat, careful way of someone who has told a story so many times inside their own mind that all the unnecessary parts have been worn away. He had been under contract to a civilian search and rescue consortium as both pilot and flight engineer, working primarily in mountain weather operations in Colorado and Wyoming, and on a Wednesday evening in February 8 years prior, he had been dispatched to retrieve 2 passengers from an aircraft that had been forced to land on a mountain pass south of Steamboat Springs. Those passengers were Everett Whitmore and Gareth Boone, whose original flight had been diverted due to instrument failure, placing them in a narrow valley as conditions deteriorated. The charter pilot had set the aircraft down on a slope before losing rotor control entirely, and when Reed arrived, the machine was on its side, burning from the forward engine compartment, with both men unable to free themselves from their harness systems. What happened in the 37 minutes that followed was not in dispute among the 3 people who had been there. What was disputed, what had been officially disputed, in writing, with signatures and legal headings, was the question of why the original aircraft had failed. Reed's post-incident inspection had turned up a pitch control bolt with deficient metallurgical composition, a component substituted at some point in the supply chain for a part that looked identical but did not meet aerospace certification requirements. He had photographed it, logged it, and submitted his findings to the investigation panel. Before the panel's final report was issued, that evidence had been removed from the file, and the report that was ultimately published stated that the crash had resulted from the charter pilot accepting a flight assignment in conditions exceeding authorized weather limits, with a supplementary finding attaching Reed's name to a procedural citation sufficient to trigger a certification review. Gareth told the rest of it quietly, and without looking at Carrington. He said that Everett Whitmore had come to him 2 weeks after the crash with a non-disclosure agreement and had asked him to sign it on the grounds that the company needed time to complete its internal review before information reached the press. Gareth had signed because he trusted Everett and believed the silence was temporary. He did not know until years later that his original statement to the investigation panel, the one that described the component failure, the one that named what he had seen Reed pull from the wreckage, had been removed from the official file before it was archived. Sloane sat very still through all of it. When Reed finished, she asked why he had never pursued legal action, and he told her that at the time of the crash, his wife had been in the second year of treatment for an illness that would take another 14 months to kill her. He had not had the resources, financial, emotional, or temporal, to sustain a legal campaign against a company with the infrastructure of Whitmore Rotorcraft. And by the time his wife died and his daughter was old enough that he had room to breathe again, the statute of limitations had closed certain avenues and his appetite for the fight had been replaced by something simpler. The ability to take contract work, keep Tessa in school, and sleep without dreaming about slopes on fire. Sloane proposed having the component analyzed in the company's internal laboratory, and Reed declined without pause, saying that the last time physical evidence from a Whitmore aircraft had entered that laboratory, it had not come back out. They agreed on a compromise, a non-destructive materials stress analysis conducted jointly, with oversight from Jonah, Reed, and Evelyn Prescott, the board's chief legal counsel, who arrived within the hour with the focused, slightly alarmed expression of a person who has been called to a meeting whose agenda was described as urgent and confidential. The preliminary findings showed the component's tensile strength at roughly 30% below the minimum threshold for certified aerospace hardware. Evelyn ran the digital certification paperwork while the others reviewed the physical results, and she found that the digital signature on the compliance certificate, the certificate vouching for this component and every other component in that batch, belonged to a quality assurance engineer who had died of a stroke 3 years prior to the date stamped on the document. Sloane issued the flight suspension internally and told her communications team to attribute the delay to weather conditions, which were in fact marginal that morning, and gave the story a plausibility it did not entirely deserve. She needed whoever had installed the counterfeit components to believe, for as long as possible, that nothing had been found, because people who believe they are not being watched behave in ways that are useful to investigators. Carrington came to her office twice in the first hour after the grounding to argue that the demonstration could proceed with the second X9 prototype, and that every hour of delay was costing the company in reputational and financial terms that could not easily be recovered. She noticed that he mentioned the share price before he mentioned the safety of the crew. Reed and Jonah spent the rest of the morning doing what neither had been asked to do, but both understood needed doing. They spot-checked 3 additional helicopters in the certified ready fleet, pulling one pitch control component from each and running the same identification comparison against the maintenance logs. 2 of the 3 aircraft were clean. The third was not. The identical counterfeit code appeared on a bolt in the tail assembly of a machine that had been cleared for a demonstration flight the previous month and had already carried passengers, which moved the problem from the category of targeted sabotage to the category of systematic supply chain corruption, not a single act of malice, but an ongoing practice embedded in the company's procurement process, invisible in the paperwork because the paperwork had been designed to conceal it. Sloane and Reed went to the physical records archive together late in the afternoon, moving through the older filing systems from the years before the company had fully digitized its documentation. And the conversation between them was sharp in the way that conversations are sharp when 2 intelligent people have been forced by circumstances into a proximity that neither sought. She told him at one point that she felt he was using her father's failure to indict not just Whitmore Rotorcraft, but the entire concept of institutional accountability, that he was, beneath the technical language, simply angry. Reed considered the accusation for a moment and told her he was not angry, that he had used up that capacity in the 2 years following his suspension, and what remained was something more straightforward. He wanted the aircraft that flew over mountain terrain carrying injured people, and the crews trying to save them to be built correctly. It was at a moment when Reed stepped away to take a call that Sloane first saw him in a context outside the one she had assigned him. The call was from his daughter, Tessa, whose voice Reed's entire body responded to in a way it did not respond to anything else in that room. He asked her whether she had eaten, whether the cold had returned to her dorm, and reminded her to check the tire pressure on her car before driving back to campus after the weekend. Ordinary instructions delivered with a focus and gentleness, entirely at odds with the man who had been standing his ground on the helipad that morning. Sloane watched without being seen watching, and revised something in her assessment. In the physical archive, they found a supplier change authorization signed by Carrington, issued 3 weeks before the crash of 8 years ago, transferring a specific category of control system fasteners from the company's certified aerospace supplier to a secondary vendor whose name appeared on no current registry of approved parts manufacturers and which had dissolved its corporate registration 11 days after the crash. The last page of the authorization, the page that would have carried the final approval signature, had been physically torn from the document. When they returned to the engineering suite, the evidence locker holding the counterfeit bolt and the testing documentation had been opened, and the component and test results were gone. The security feed showed Reed as the last person to enter the room, and airport security arrived 15 minutes later, with a detention order citing suspected sabotage and evidence theft. Reed went with the security officers, without resistance, without raising his voice, without the kind of argument that would have given anyone watching a reason to remember him as difficult. The only thing he said, before the security office door closed behind him, was directed at Sloane. That what was happening now was identical in sequence to what had happened 8 years ago, and that she should think carefully about which part she wanted to play this time. Sloane stood in the corridor for a long moment after the door closed. Carrington appeared at her shoulder almost immediately, suggesting that a clear and early public statement identifying Reed as a disruptive element would protect both the company's credibility and its stock position going into the next trading session. The board's risk committee sent a formal recommendation within the hour asking that Sloane distance herself from Reed's involvement in the grounding decision. The pressure was the purest form of pressure because it was not unreasonable on its surface. There was a security image showing Reed near the evidence locker. There was a history, official, documented, publicly archived, of Reed Callahan making claims about Whitmore aircraft that had been found to lack merit. There was the practical reality that defending a man who had been publicly removed by security required a level of certain knowledge that Sloane did not quite yet have. The logic of self-preservation was coherent. It was also, as Sloane was beginning to understand, exactly the same logic her father had used 8 years ago. Gareth spent 40 minutes in the security room reviewing the original footage without announcing to anyone that he was doing so. He found what he was looking for in the reflection of a glass door panel at the end of the corridor. The clock on the hallway wall behind the camera showed a time that did not match the timestamp burned into the footage file. The footage had been composed from 2 separate segments, matched well enough to pass casual inspection but not careful inspection, and the discrepancy between the clock and the timestamp was the kind of error that only appears when 2 recordings recorded at different times are joined. He brought the analysis to Evelyn, who had been simultaneously pulling the facility's badge access records and had found that Carrington's badge had logged a scan on the engineering floor 7 minutes after the timestamp showing Reed departing the building. Carrington stated that his badge had been cloned, which was a claim difficult to immediately disprove and had the quality of a prepared response. Sloane went to the security office herself and told the duty officer that Reed had been on the facility at the company's documented request, that his access to the maintenance area was fully authorized by the acting chief test pilot, and that the basis for an intrusion charge therefore did not exist. Reed was released into the corridor, and Sloan stood in front of him and told him she was sorry for what she had done on the helipad. Not as the company's CEO managing a liability, but as the person who had struck him. Reed looked at her and said that the apology was accepted, but that the problem had never been the physical act. The problem was that she had used the authority of her position to convict him in front of 40 witnesses before allowing him to complete a single sentence. He did not say it unkindly. He said it as a person states a fact that will need to be true for any future interaction to have integrity. Sloan did not defend herself. She said he was correct, and that she intended to demonstrate the correction through her conduct rather than through further explanation. It was not a performance of contrition, but the specific tone of a person who has identified their own error with the same directness they would apply to an external problem, and Reed recognized it as such. He told her he was leaving the project. Gareth found him in the parking structure and stood in front of his truck and said, simply, that the two of them had had a conversation 8 years ago that Gareth had not fulfilled, and he could not fix what had already happened, but there were 26 counterfeit components currently distributed across a fleet of aircraft operated by people who did not know they were flying on fraudulent hardware, and those people included helicopter crews responding to medical emergencies across 4 states in the Mountain West. Reed accepted the argument, returned to the engineering suite, and gave Sloan 3 conditions. The entire flight line was to be suspended, and each aircraft individually inspected. The findings were to go directly to the Federal Aviation Administration without passing through any internal review, and no member of the board was to have editorial authority over the inspection report. Sloan agreed, knowing what it would cost her. When Reed ran the inventory numbers that evening, he found the scope was worse than they had known. At minimum, 26 faulty fasteners had been distributed across the active fleet, and one of them was installed in the X-9, scheduled for the board demonstration the following morning. Sloan's cancellation order for that demonstration had been entered into the scheduling system, but had never appeared in the dispatch queue, because someone with administrator-level access had deleted it. They worked through the night, the 4 of them, Sloan, Reed, Gareth, Evelyn, with coffee going cold in paper cups and the facility empty except for the cleaning crew and the security rotation that Gareth had reorganized so that no one on duty had been hired within the last 18 months. The question of who had deleted the cancellation order narrowed quickly when Evelyn pulled the system permission logs. Only 3 accounts held the authorization level required to make that kind of modification. 2 of them belonged to Sloan and to the scheduling administrator. The third had belonged to Everett Whitmore and had been set to expire upon completion of the estate settlement process, a process that, by a legal oversight nobody had caught, had never been fully completed, leaving the account dormant in the system but technically active, with its last recorded use showing a timestamp from 72 hours prior. Gareth was the one who remembered the notebook. He said that in the months after the crash, Everett had begun carrying a small leather-bound journal with him everywhere, to meetings, on flights, to the private dinners Gareth had waited outside of in the corridor. Before Everett died, he had arranged for his personal effects to be transferred to a secured private storage unit at the regional airport. Not the company's facility, not the company's archive, but a private unit rented in his name that Sloan had been notified of and had never visited. They drove there before 5 in the morning, and the storage unit contained 3 cardboard boxes, a flight jacket Sloan did not touch, and the journal. Inside the journal was a handwritten letter addressed to no one, or possibly to everyone, The kind of letter a person writes when they have decided they cannot send it but cannot stop composing it either. Everett admitted in the letter that he had known, within 10 days of the crash, that the bolt Reed had identified was consistent with a supply chain substitution Carrington had authorized. He had known because Carrington had come to him and told him so, not as a confession, but as a negotiation. The public acknowledgement of a defective component would trigger a cascade of liability reviews that the company, already managing 2 pending regulatory matters, would not survive intact, and Carrington had laid out the arithmetic with the calm precision of a man who had already decided the outcome before entering the room. Thousands of jobs, 3 state facilities, military procurement contracts. Everett had agreed to allow the investigation to be redirected, and had believed, he wrote, that he could correct the supply chain problem privately, quietly, without additional harm to anyone. He had been wrong about Carrington's intentions. Carrington had not stopped at suppressing the investigation. He had recognized the leverage he now held over Everett Whitmore and had used it to expand the counterfeit parts operation into a profit-generating enterprise, channeling payments through a network of shell companies and taking his margin on every fraudulent component that moved through the supply chain. The encrypted key taped inside a folded map at the bottom of the box opened a digital archive on the company's isolated server containing payment records, years of them, running into amounts that explained why Carrington's private investment portfolio had grown so substantially during a period when his official compensation had not. The same archive showed correspondence between Carrington and an executive at Vanderhall Aerospace, outlining the terms of an acquisition agreement contingent on Whitmore's stock price falling below a specific threshold. Carrington was positioned to profit from the acquisition. He needed Whitmore to fail, and the most efficient path to that failure was a serious incident involving an X9, one attributable to a CEO's poor judgment or a pilot's miscalculation, rather than to systemic defect, because systemic defect pointed backward toward Carrington, while human error pointed only forward and away from him. Reed read the letter last. When he set it down, Sloane was watching him across the table, and she saw him do something she would not have predicted. He said nothing. He did not take satisfaction in the vindication. He did not remind her of what the past 8 years had cost him. He said, after a long silence, that a person could make a cowardly choice and still be genuinely loved by the people they left behind, and that what mattered now was not what her father had done, but what she would do when the same arithmetic was placed in front of her. The camera on the exterior feed Gareth had left running on his phone showed the X9 with the counterfeit fastener being towed from the hangar to the demonstration pad in the pre-dawn dark, its engine beginning to cycle up. The board, the lenders, and the client delegation were scheduled to arrive in 4 hours. Carrington had never intended to wait for a decision. They arrived back at the facility as the first vehicles of the delegation were already in the parking structure. The demonstration pad was lit, the presentation audio was running, and Carrington was standing at the entrance of the VIP pavilion in a suit that had clearly been pressed that morning, greeting board members with the relaxed authority of a man who has concluded that his principal obstacle has removed herself. He turned when Sloane walked in and told the assembled group that the CEO had been under considerable personal strain in recent days, and that he had been authorized by the Risk Committee to oversee the demonstration in her place, a framing so smooth and so publicly delivered that challenging it in front of clients and lenders would have required Sloane to appear exactly as he was describing her. Jonah was not in the cockpit of the X9. The pilot running through the pre-start checklist was a contract pilot named Marcus Welch, who had been called in at 6 that morning and told he was flying a showcase demonstration for a major client, who had been given a flight briefing and an aircraft file neither of which mentioned a ground stop. Reed could not reach the aircraft directly. The tail rotor was already turning at idle, and the rotor wash over the demonstration pad created pressure conditions that made a direct approach on foot without authorization physically dangerous. He went to the maintenance frequency on the ground crew radio and found it locked. Switched to the backup channel Carrington had specified in the revised morning briefing notes, and found that locked as well. Sloan moved to the media platform at the edge of the pavilion and asked the facility technician quietly to cut the presentation audio. The technician looked at Carrington and then at Sloan and chose Sloan, a decision made in under 2 seconds based on what he had seen on the helipad the previous morning. The audio cut. The sudden silence over the demonstration pad was the first indication most of the delegation had that something outside the script was happening. Sloan stepped to the podium and said, in a voice that carried to the back row without requiring a microphone, that Whitmore Rotorcraft had identified non-certified components in a portion of its active fleet and was placing all demonstration and operational flights on immediate hold pending a comprehensive inspection and verification program. She said it was not a decision that was good for the company's short-term position, and she was making it anyway. The reaction was the reaction such announcements produce, the particular quality of collective attention that a room adopts when it realizes it is watching something that will be discussed later. Carrington stepped forward and told the board, loudly enough for the clients to hear, that the CEO had allowed a discredited former contractor to compromise her judgment, and that the claims being made had already been reviewed and found to be without technical foundation. Reed, standing at the edge of the pad, picked up the emergency wind light signal panel mounted to the ground crew station, a row of amber lanterns used to communicate landing vectors to approaching aircraft in poor visibility, and began flashing the ground abort sequence toward the cockpit. It was not a radio signal, but it was a sequence that Marcus Welch had been trained to recognize, and he recognized it. Jonah had made his way to the secondary control tower on the far side of the apron and obtained access to the ground control frequency through the tower's direct line, transmitting a formal stop taxi order over the airport's primary coordination channel, a transmission that Welch was legally obligated to comply with regardless of who had hired him. The X-9's engine reduced to idle. The rotors slowed. Welch stepped out of the cockpit, looked around the pad with the expression of a pilot who has just been told 3 different things by 3 different sources, and did the professionally correct thing by standing beside the aircraft and not moving it. Carrington turned toward the hangar where a transport helicopter was parked and had already instructed 2 staff members to begin loading the evidence containers, the flagged component logs, and the physical samples from the morning's testing into the cargo bay, with the stated purpose of transporting them to a private laboratory. Gareth noticed the transport helicopter's running lights come on without a logged departure plan in the scheduling system, and he did not have to consider for long what that meant. Reed did not sprint across the tarmac or attempt anything that would have given the attorneys a useful image later. He moved to the ground crew utility station at the base of the control tower access road and activated the taxiway safety lock sequence, a system installed for high-wind ground operations that engaged a series of retractable anchor pins in the concrete taxiway surfaces, preventing any aircraft from rolling across them without triggering a hard lock on the nose gear. It was a system he knew because he had helped write the specification for it 4 years prior, under a contract for a different facility, and the underlying engineering was standard enough that he did not need to check anything. The transport helicopter moved 2 meters before the nose gear locked, and the aircraft settled to a complete, undignified stop in the middle of the taxiway. Jonah directed a maintenance tug to park across the primary exit corridor, citing a fuel line inspection under the Ground Operations Protocol, a citation that required any departing aircraft to wait for written clearance from the safety officer, a role currently occupied by Reed, who had been formally reinstated to the facility's authorized personnel list by Sloan's authorization 18 minutes earlier. Carrington stepped off the transport helicopter with the expression of a man who is recalculating distances and finding them all shorter than he had believed. He addressed the board members who had followed the situation to the apron and told them that Sloan had lost her perspective, that Reed Callahan was a known bad actor with a personal grievance against the company, and that he had a signed investigation report from 8 years ago that proved it. Gareth stepped forward in front of the assembled board, the lenders, the delegation representatives, and the facility staff who had drifted toward the apron as the morning unfolded. He gave his statement fully, for the first time publicly, with the specificity and precision of a man who has been preparing to say something for 8 years. He described the crash, the fire, the 2 failed extractions before Reed succeeded, the harness lock, the scar, and the contents of the statement he had originally given to the investigation panel. The statement that had been removed from the file before the report was finalized. Evelyn set her briefcase on the hood of a nearby vehicle and presented Everett's letter, the payment records from the encrypted archive, and the badge access log showing Carrington's entry to the engineering floor at the time the evidence had gone missing. She said nothing dramatic. She simply placed the documents in sequence, the way a lawyer places documents when the sequence does the necessary work by itself. Carrington said the documents could have been fabricated. Reed walked to the transport helicopter's cargo bay, opened it, and read aloud the batch number from the first component in the top tray, a number that matched the counterfeit code exactly and that appeared in the encrypted payment records tied to Carrington's shell company network. The Federal Aviation inspectors arrived 22 minutes later, having been contacted the previous evening by Evelyn on a preliminary notification basis, and they sealed the facility, tagged every aircraft, and removed the cargo containers under inventory. 2 federal agents accompanied Carrington to a waiting vehicle. No one raised their voice. No one ran. The morning's outcome arrived not through a confrontation, but through the accumulated weight of things that had been written down, photographed, signed, and logged by people who had not known at the time that those records would eventually be the entire story. When the pad had emptied of officials and the demonstration guests had been escorted to the conference area, Sloan stood in the quiet and looked at the X-9 sitting inert under the morning sky. Reed stood beside her and said that she had not destroyed Whitmore today. She had only stopped it from continuing to fly on a lie. 3 days after the events on the demonstration pad, Sloan held a press briefing in the main auditorium at Whitmore Rotorcraft and announced a voluntary recall of all Flightline helicopters for independent inspection, the suspension of the company's entire certified parts program pending a third-party supply chain audit, and the filing of a formal request with the appropriate aviation authorities to reopen the investigation report from 8 years prior. She did not position the announcement as damage control. She described it as a correction, not complete, not sufficient to undo what had been done, but a beginning from which something honest might be built. She spoke about her father without the practiced reverence she had always used in public. She said that Everett Whitmore had been a skilled engineer, a complicated man, and a person who had made at least one choice she could not defend and would not attempt to defend, and that the company bearing his name would not honor his memory by protecting the consequences of that choice. Before the full staff assembled in the facility's main floor, she turned directly to Reed and acknowledged what had been done to him, beginning 8 years ago and continuing through the previous 72 hours. She said she could not give back the years, She said she intended to give back what she could. Reed accepted the written apology and the credential restoration through the company's legal resources, and declined the financial compensation, requesting instead that Whitmore establish an independent flight safety division, staffed by engineers with no reporting line to the CEO or the board, with unilateral authority to ground any aircraft in the fleet without requiring executive approval. The request revealed something to Sloan that the previous 3 days had been building toward. Reed was not interested in what Whitmore could give him. He was interested in what Whitmore could stop doing. She offered him the directorship of the division, and he said no initially, for the straightforward reason that he did not want his future tied once more to the name that had governed his past. What changed his mind was not the offer or the salary, but the engineers. The 12 of them who had stayed voluntarily through the weekend, running component checks on the grounded fleet without being asked, without overtime authorization, because they cared whether the aircraft they worked on were sound. He told Sloan he would accept on the condition that every finding from the division went to the regulators unedited and in full. She said yes without qualification. Gareth handed Reed a certified copy of the restored testimony the following morning, and whatever Reed felt in that moment he kept to himself, which was his way with the things that mattered most. 6 months after the demonstration pad had been sealed and reopened and reorganized under new protocols, Whitmore rotorcraft operated at roughly 2/3 of its previous capacity, leaner, audited, and free of 3 board members who had resigned in the weeks following Carrington's arrest. The contract with the hospital consortium had been canceled by mutual agreement and replaced 4 months later by a smaller deal signed after the company completed the most rigorous independent airworthiness review its category had seen in the previous decade. Reed's certification had been formally restored, and he kept his work hours consistent and reasonable, spent weekends answering Tessa's questions about flight mechanics with the patient detail of a man who finds teaching more satisfying than being taught, and drove the same battered pickup he had driven to the facility on the morning everything began. Sloan no longer managed the company exclusively from the executive floor. She had moved her working routine down to the engineering level 2 days a week, sitting with the teams who built and maintained the aircraft rather than receiving summaries of what those teams had decided, and it was a small change in geography that turned out to produce a large change in what she understood. On the morning of the Reformed Flight Division's first full test sequence, Sloan asked Reed whether he trusted the aircraft waiting on the pad. He ran his eyes across the instrument panel in the quiet way he ran his eyes across anything structural, and then he said he trusted the people who had been willing to say something was wrong before it became unfixable. Before they boarded, Sloan reached out and let her fingers rest briefly near the crescent-shaped scar on his wrist, and then she stopped and waited. Reed did not pull away. Gareth watched from several paces behind them and said nothing at all. The helicopter lifted into the early light without anything hidden beneath it, and this time no one on the ground had any reason to look away.